Before Baumeister would become a prolific, horrible serial killer, he was a pillar of his community. He was a doting father. He was a loving husband. His neighbors enjoyed spending time with him because he was high energy and he threw great parties. But what people didn't know from outward appearances is that he was schizophrenic and had been diagnosed at a young age. He also had this deep obsession with death and dying that he could never quite shake. His morbid obsession would ultimately take over, and he would go on to end the lives of nearly 24 young men in Indiana. And he would bury the majority of them on his property, which was known as Fox Hollow Farm. When an investigation into all these missing young men in Indiana points at Baumeister being the primary suspect, Baumeister flees his property and ultimately ends his own life. And in the note he leaves, he just says that the reason he's taking his own life is because his business is failing and so is his marriage. He doesn't confess to any of the murders. He doesn't give investigators any indication of how many people. He killed or where they are. He didn't give any closure to anyone. He just took his own life, and that was that. And so, while investigators did a very thorough search of the property that Baumeister owned, the Fox Hollow Farms property, and found over 5,000 human bone fragments and were able to identify a number of victims, they believe that there are more victims buried at Fox Hollow Farms that we may never uncover. So our story picks up over a decade later when two new owners come in, purchase Fox Hollow Farms, and almost immediately, very strange things start happening in and around the property. Then they record this very famous audio recording inside the property, which, that in conjunction with the other strange things that they had seen around the property, leads them to believe that Fox Hollow Farms is haunted. So, before we get into their story and we listen to that audio recording, if you're interested in strange, dark, and mysterious content like what I'm promising on today's episode, then you've come to the right place because this is the type of content that I produce 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that interests you, if you would please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these uploads every week. So let's dive in. In 2006, Rob, Vicky Graves, and their 2 teenage sons were tired of living the city, fast-paced lifestyle and decided to look for some property in suburban Indiana, where they could kind of escape that busy lifestyle. And so when they were looking at real estate in some of the nicer suburbs of Indiana, they found this one property called Fox Hollow Farms that was this huge, sprawling estate but was selling for some unbelievably cheap price. So they contact a real estate agent who says, "Yeah, we'd love to give you a tour of the place. It's up for sale. No one's occupying it right now. It's owned by an investor, but they are looking to sell, obviously. So yeah, let's do a house tour." And so they're open-minded. It seems too good to be true, but they decide. You know what they decide. We'll go take a look. And so they get to this property and it's beautiful. It is everything they wanted there. This dream home they're looking for to be. You know, as an indoor swimming pool, it's got loads of bedrooms and bathrooms. It's like basically a mansion. And as they're walking around the property, Rob is speaking to his wife, Vicky, and they're both kind of going back and forth like, what's wrong with this place? This doesn't make any sense. Rob starts to wonder, wait a second, I think I've heard of this place on TV before. And he's having like an epiphany and he's like, I think that this could actually be the home of one of the most notorious serial killers in Indiana's history, Baumeister. It's like it just came to him that the name Fox Hollow Farm was something he remembered hearing on TV. And so he stops the real estate agent on their turn. He says, "Hey, this is a beautiful home, but is this the home of Baumeister?" And the real estate agent, almost expecting this to be brought up, was like, yes. That's why it's still on the market. People are unwilling to purchase this home, even though the investor who scooped this up in the 90 seconds, following the tragedy that was the Baumeister case, the investor had basically gutted the whole residence and basically removed all the kind of remnants of what it used to look like when Baumeister was living there. Nobody wanted it because, Baumeister killed nearly 24 young men and buried them on the property. And investigators still were finding pieces of bone on the property, and they didn't really know how many victims there were. And so it was just kind of a spooky place to live. And so the real estate agent just said that's why it's so cheap. The property is beautiful, it's well kept, but no one wants to be here cause of the history. The real estate agent says here, why don't you and your wife just go talk about it? We can leave if you guys are comfortable with this. Ultimately, they decide to purchase the property. So, a couple weeks later, Rob and Vicky and their 2 teenage sons move into Fox Hollow Farms. And they love it. And especially their 2 teenage sons love swimming in the pool, and they had gotten in the habit of basically running around outside and then tracking in dirt and gravel into the swimming pool. And so one day, Vicky is vacuuming up some of this dirt and gravel that had gotten inside of the area around the pool. And so she's vacuuming up the gravel, and all of a sudden, her vacuum cuts out. And in fact, the power cord where the vacuum was attached to had come undone. And so she thinks, oh, I must have, yanked on the cord and pulled it out of the outlet. And so she goes over and she plugs it back in, and she goes back to vacuuming up the gravel that was in the pool. And so as she's doing that, it goes out again, which surprised her because she remembered thinking to herself like, don't yank on the cord cause you just unplugged it. And she turns around, and now the cord from the vacuum and the outlet it was plugged into are separated by about a foot. It was as if it had been yanked out pretty hard. And she's thinking to herself like, did I just yank on it again? Am I wrapped on a chair or something? How did I yank it out? And how did it move a foot away from the outlet? And so after she plugs it in, she checks it and kind of yanks on it, to make sure it's not falling out on its own. It's not a, kind of weak connection to the port. And it's not. And they're secure. And she goes back to vacuuming, and she's looking over her shoulder and checking the outlet as she's vacuuming, wondering what was causing it to pop out of the socket like that. And as she's looking at it, she watches it pop out of the socket again. Except it didn't just fall to the ground. It jumped out as if there was a surge of electricity that, popped it out of the socket or something. And she drops the vacuum because it startled her, and she didn't know what to make of it. Rob worked at a car dealership, and one of his employees, Joe, was chronically late. And it got to the point where Rob's like, Joe, what's going on? Why are you always late? And Joe said, I live over an hour away and I can't get here on time. I gotta find somewhere, to live that's closer to the dealership. And Rob is like, well, actually, we have an entire apartment attached to our residence at Fox Hollow Farms that no one's staying in. We'd be happy to let you rent that out. It's right down the road. And Joe's like, actually, that sounds pretty great. And so just a couple days later, Rob helps Joe move into the new apartment. And they spend the whole day moving all the boxes and furniture in there. And just in the span of just a few hours, they move everything into Joe's apartment. Rob leaves. Joe is exhausted. It's just he and his dog, Fred. And Joe just decides to crash for the night. And he lays down in the bed and falls asleep. And so, that night, he has this dream where he's being chased by someone. He doesn't know what it is, but it causes him to actually act out his dream like sleepwalk. He jumps up out of his bed and starts running as if he needs to escape the apartment, but he's kind of half dreaming. And he runs into the door frame, falls to the ground, knocks a glass over, and actually cuts his hands up pretty bad. And so he comes to, and he's looking around, and he's like, what was that? So a couple days later, Vicky comes home and she finds Rob painting the side of the house. And she and Rob stop and are talking about how beautiful it's gonna look when the painting's done. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Vicky sees something in the forest that was on the edge of their property. And it was actually a man standing with a red t-shirt on, just standing, looking at their property. And as she's looking at him, he turns around and he starts walking away farther into the forest. And so she kind of looks, and before she says anything to Rob, the guy has just vanished into the woods. And so she just goes, Rob, I just saw someone standing on our property. Had a red shirt on, and he was right over there. And Rob immediately is like, well, honestly, we moved into a serial killer's house. We should accept that there's going to be people that are just going to want to sneak onto our property to get a look at this building. And so they walk over to where Vicky has seen this guy in red, and they look in, and there's no one there. They yell out like, hey, is anybody eerie? And no one's there. And so, even though it was pretty unsettling, Vicky and Rob just decide that, I guess, this is the reality of living here, is that you're going to have people spying on you a little bit because of the notoriety of the home. So later that night, Joe is in his apartment and he's doing some dishes. And it's late at night, probably like 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and he hears a knock on the door. And he's literally mid-dishes. His hands are wet. And so he turns off the water and he yells out, hey, just a second. And he starts stoweling off his hands. And as he's doing that, the knocking gets louder and more aggressive. And he's like, hey, hold on. I'm just drying my hands off. Hold on. And he assumes it's Vicky or Rob. And so he starts walking over and the knocking is just incessant. And he finally opens the door and no one's there. It wasn't like the knocking was going on unstopped and then he went over there and opened it. It was literally like the knocking was happening as he's opening the door and no one is standing there. He's like immediately on guard. Like, okay, is someone like on the roof, like bending down? Is someone hiding? Like, what's going on? And he kind of pokes his head out and he's looking around and he actually steps out onto the front steps there onto there. And he's looking around and he figured, like, if someone had knocked, they'd be running away if they're gone already. And he can't hear anything. It's just silent. There's no one there. And then he goes back into his apartment, shuts it, bolts the door shut, and out of the corner of his eye, he spots what looks like a man in his bedroom, basically just walking past the door frame into his bedroom. And it totally startles him. His dog starts growling and looking in the direction of the bedroom. And so he walks over there and looks in his bedroom, and there's nothing there. He flips on all the lights, he looks around, and he's like, what's going on here? Like it totally scared him. So Joe had only been in this apartment for about 3 weeks, and one of the things he had kind of developed a habit doing was in the evenings. He would take his dog Fred for a walk along the driveway that was, well lit. And the driveway was pretty long. It's a big piece of property. And he would take his dog up to the end of the driveway and then walk back. And because of what he's just witnessed with the knocking on the door and what looked like someone in his apartment, he decides he just wants to clear his head and go on a walk with his dog. And he figured he could maybe swing by the main house and see if the lights were on in Rob and Vicky's house. Because in some way, maybe if their lights were on, it would indicate that maybe they had been over and had been knocking on this door. Like tomorrow he'll find out what it was about. Like he's searching for a way to rationalize this. And he notices right away that Vicky and Rob's house is totally dark. They're asleep. He doesn't make it very far when his dog stops. The dog starts taking off into the tree line. And before Joe actually takes off after his dog, he looks up and he breaks out through some of the lighting over the driveway that there is a man in red with a red t-shirt. That's at the edge of the forest. And his back is turned and he's walking into the forest. And as Joe's looking, it looks like the man in red actually disappears. And so the dog is heading straight for this man in red. And so Joe, because it's his dog, he loves his dog, he starts running after the dog. Even though he's absolutely terrified of what's going to happen here. He couldn't let his dog get harmed. So he chases into the woods, makes it like a few feet into the woods, where he finds his dog that's now not barking and is actually facing back out at Joe. And it's kind of cowering, looking at where Joe is now standing. And Joe kind of begins to turn, and the man in red is standing right next to him, looking directly at Joe. And Joe just panics and starts running out. doesn't stop to do anything. The dog follows Joe and they run back to Joe's apartment, run upstairs, shut the door, shut the blinds, lock everything, and they just sit there for the rest of the night. Joe was literally checking his window and looking outside cause he doesn't know if he just saw that or not, because that person in red had vanished a minute ago. He thought that perhaps he was convincing himself that he saw someone in red because he had just seen like a ghost in his apartment like a few minutes earlier, and he's starting to think that maybe he's just kind of hallucinating all this stuff, or that he's imagining all this stuff. So he wasn't quite prepared to go tell Rob and Vicky or do anything about it, so he just spent the night, basically, looking out his window and making sure no one was coming into his residence again. And so, the next morning, he goes and tells Rob and Vicky what happened the night before, everything from the knocking on the door, to the, person that he thought he saw inside of his apartment, to then, ultimately, the man in red that his dog chased after her. As he's telling them about this exchange with the man in red, Vicky is getting pretty emotional. And Vicky is like, I saw a man in red. And she points to the area of their property. And it's the same area that Joe had just been describing where this had all happened. She was like, I saw a man in red right over there. Like, what's going on? So that night, Joe was in his apartment and Joe is definitely on edge about what had happened the night before. He's increasingly almost listening for noises outside because of how scary the night before was, and he forgoes his walk on the driveway with his dog. I think he's pretty much done doing that after that encounter. And as he's in his apartment, he hears knocking on the door again. And he yells, who's at the door? And no answer. But the knocking continues. And it's one of those knockers. It's the actual knocker on the outside of the door that's being hit over and over again. You can see the door actually shaking from how hard this is being banged against the door. And finally, after poking his head out and seeing no one, he rips the door open and no one's there. And he looks at the door itself, and the knocker is perpendicular to the ground, like someone's holding it up, but no one's there. And as he's looking at it, it swings down and knocks the door one last time. He slams the door shut, locks it, and he's absolutely petrified. He sees the doorknob on the door start to turn. He can hear the sound of the spring tightening as the doorknob slowly turns all the way over into the open position. The door's locked, but the doorknob's been twisted. And he's looking at the door, and then there's silence after the doorknob's being held in the, call it, open position. And then all of a sudden, it bursts open, breaking the law. No one's outside. And he looks at it and he's absolutely frozen for a second. And then he just runs out of his apartment to see who is doing this. No one's there. When he turns around and looks into his apartment, he sees a man in white, not in red, who is soaked head to toe, screaming and running towards him, who runs out of the apartment past him and vanishes into the air. And so, he takes off. Joe, he's not sticking around, grabs dog, runs to Rob and Vicky's, and he goes in and tells them what happened. Joe, Rob, and Vicky are so scared that now they're not trying to rationalize that this wasn't a ghost, let's say. They're trying to convince themselves that this is a friendly ghost, that these are the victims of Herbert Baumeister, that have been tormented by Baumeister, but they're here because they're trapped here. That man you saw in your apartment, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister escaping from Herbert Baumeister. The man in red, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister. We're dealing with the victims here because so many people had their lives snuffed out here. And so it isn't really calming them, but it's like they're creating a narrative that fits what's happening, because without a story, this is impossible to understand. So they really start to believe that what they're experiencing is a haunting, but it is of Herb Baumeister's victims, basically acting out their final moments or kind of leading them to, what happened to these victims. And so that night, Joe, Rob, and Vicky start going online and researching who the victims were. The known victims of Herb Baumeister. There's images of all of these different victims, and as they're scrolling through all the pictures, Joe stops them on one and he goes, "That's the guy that was in my apartment. That looks exactly like the guy that was soaking wet, screaming, that ran out of my apartment." That confirms. Ugh. Ugh. This is a confirmation to the three of them that the entity they're experiencing in this property is definitely the victims. So they do feel reassured at this point. Scared, but reassured that these are the victims. And so they start really aggressively researching the Baumeister case, and they come to realize that there's actually a number of victims, more than likely, that have not been uncovered that have been buried on this property, only lending in their mind more credibility to the idea that this is a property that is haunted by the victims of Baumeister Earl. And so after a couple of days where there isn't much activity, Joe decides to go for a walk in the woods in the same area where the man in red had been seen by Vicky and by himself a couple days earlier. And he just decides, in broad daylight, I'm gonna go for a walk with my dog out in the woods. And so he starts walking in that direction and literally sitting on the leaves, practically on the trail in plain sight, is a human bone. It's a femur bone just sitting on the trail. The idea that bone wouldn't have been located during the extensive search for bones on this property is nearly impossible to Joe. The way he described it is, I feel like that bone was left there for me to discover it. That the man in Reed, who was more than likely a victim of Baumeister, had led me to finding that bone. And so they believe, Joe, Rob, and Vicky, that when they send this bone in for forensic analysis, that they'll determine that this was another victim that perhaps hasn't been identified yet. And they're kind of expecting it to be, the man in Reed, whoever that was. And so they end up calling, Rob ends up calling the lead detective from the Baumeister case and says, hey, we found a bone. And so they submit that and they take it in as evidence. And Rob asks the lead investigator if he would mind coming to the property and just kind of explaining to them, where things occurred on the property relative to the Baumeister case. Where did all the tragedy unfold? Where were people buried? Just to give us a sense of what we're dealing with here. And so the investigator agrees, and the investigator comes out, and the vast majority of the killings happened in the swimming pool, where Baumeister would basically lure young men to come to his property to go swimming. And as soon as they got in the pool, he would strangle them to death. And the weird thing about the pool area is that Baumeister was, a psychopath. And he had put mannequins all over the inside of this swimming pool that had, party outfits on. And so there are these very eerie pictures of the swimming pool with, mannequins all around the outside. And it was basically a place where he lured his victims on to ended their lives. A couple days later, Joe was in his apartment and, he's doing some work at his computer and he hears a metallic scraping sound. Coming from his kitchen. And so he goes over to his kitchen. And he finds that all of the knives that were in his butcher's block have been pulled out and lined up neatly in the bottom of his sink. Very neatly arranged. And he's looking at it I didn't do that. And he turns towards his workstation, as if to, look around the room. And he notices on the island that sits where he was standing. Right in front of him, a little bit low down, halfway up the island, there's all these fresh cut marks in the wood. Quite a number of cut marks across the wood. And he's looking at that and he's thinking to himself, is this one of the victims telling me that, perhaps they have been attacked with a knife right here in the kitchen. He's thinking it's his duty too, to try to figure out, which victim this was and what happened to them. And so he gets his iPhone out and he turns on the voice recorder and he starts recording and asking some questions of the room. And you first make sure to turn off the TV, turn off the AC, so it's quiet. And so with his recorder, he starts asking who is, anybody here is, and there's silence. And he's who was the person in the kitchen? Who was walking through the kitchen? And there's silence. And then when he asks again about was there anybody in the kitchen, his dog starts growling in and reacting to something in the room. And now Joe hasn't heard anything. He's not heard any confirmation that, there's someone in the room. He actually felt quite silly doing it. He takes his phone back to his computer, cause he takes his dog growling as maybe somehow confirmation that there was something there. And he downloads the audio file. and he listens to it. And as he's listening to the file, right after he asks about is there anybody in the kitchen, he gets a response who keeps walking in the kitchen. Who's in the kitchen? The married one. And so as Joe is looking through all their files, he's seeing that every single victim was single. No one's married. They're all young men who are single. The only one who was married involved in this case was none other than the serial killer himself, Baumeister. And so Joe has had this revelation, and it's when he realizes that it's not just the victims here. Baumeister, the serial killer himself, is haunting this property. So I'd love to hear what you think is going on at Fox Hollow Farm. Whether this is a haunting with Baumeister himself showing himself and speaking on audio files, or if this is just a big hoax. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want to get in touch with me, please direct message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen over there as well. And again, if you haven't already, please gently assassinate the like button and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my 3-2 for weekly uploads that look and sound an awful lot like this one. That's gonna do it, guys. Thank you very much, guys, for sticking around till the very end, and I will talk to you soon. Many people have claimed over the years to have been abducted by aliens, and realistically, there's no tangible evidence that any human being has ever actually set foot in an extraterrestrial spacecraft or another dimension or anything like that. It's just these crazy stories from people that claim this happened to them. And while many of these stories are very quickly cast aside as absolute hoax, not true, not accurate, there's one story, one abduction story, that is universally regarded as the most believable and most famous alien abduction story, and that is of Travis Walton. What made this case so famous is that, unlike all of the other alien abduction cases where there is never any proof, it was usually one person's first-hand account. In this case, you have a full-scale police investigation. You have up to 16 lie detector tests that were taken by Travis Walton himself, along with the other witnesses and people that were there. And you have a group of 6 level-headed guys that actually witnessed the abduction take place and have stuck to their story and have passed all lie detector tests and have never changed their story in 40 years. And you would think that at some point you might change your story because they came under incredible scrutiny. I mean, it basically derailed most of their careers in their lives because they were labeled as crazy people for believing that a UFO had abducted Travis Walton. I mean, in a way they became famous, but in all the worst ways. So, you have all these elements that make this story seem fairly credible. And even if this wasn't an alien abduction, let's say, how do you account for the past lie detector tests that are talking about UFOs? How do you account for the fact that Travis Walton was really missing for 5 days and has no idea where he was, and there was a full search effort to find him in the area where you would have been? So, lots of unanswered questions. But the story itself of when he was actually abducted, and then his own story about what happened once he had been abducted, it makes for just an incredible story. It's been converted into books and movies, and to this day, it remains one of, if not the single most fascinating purported alien abduction stories ever. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well, then you've come to the right channel because that's all I do, and I upload 3 to 4 of these stories every week. So if that's something that interests you, I would encourage you to gently extrapolate the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. Alright, let's dive into the story. By 1975, Travis Walton, who was 22 years old at the time, had developed a bad boy reputation in his hometown of Snowflake, Arizona. He rode a noisy Harley-Davidson motorcycle through town. He was a wild bull rider. And he was a boxer. And there was this story about Travis when he was with his friends in a car and they were driving down this road and a bear jumped out of the woods and landed in the middle of the road and was just standing there. And Travis, without any hesitation, leaps out of his car and chases after this huge bear and scares it into the woods. And in fact, chased it up into the woods. So Travis was just known as this kind of rebel, problem child a little bit, but he was beloved by his friends. He was just like one of those cool guys that just... He did it his own way. So Travis and the 6 other men that he worked with, were loggers. They were given contracts and they would go out and they would clear trees in a certain area. They were not big time with huge equipment to do this. We're talking chainsaws, saw and regular saws and axes. And they would just go out, these blue collar, like hard-working type guys, and they would clear areas of trees. That's what they did. Now, these 7 men, they did a dangerous job. I mean, you're cutting down these huge trees and you're usually working pretty quickly. You're operating, chainsaws that are pretty dangerous. And Mike Rogers, who was the crew boss who was there the day of this event, he described in a number of his interviews that, the men that he hired to do these jobs, they needed to be incredibly level-headed. They did not strike you as people that would have this fantastical, alien encounter story. On November 5th, 1975, Mike Rogers was given a contract to clear out this huge 12-acre plot of land inside of the Sitgreaves National Forest, and he grabbed his crew. They piled into the one pickup truck that Mike owned, and Mike knew that this was going to be a really, really difficult job. It was a huge area to cover, and he told his men up front, "We're going to be working really, really hard, so expect long, full days." And so over the first 3 days of the job, even though they were working, long hours and barely taking any breaks, they were behind schedule. At the end of this 3rd day, it's late at night. They've worked all day and everybody is just totally exhausted. And so finally, they wrap up and they all pile back into Mike's truck, all 7 of them, and they start driving the access road back down, to the main road to get back to the town. And as they're driving, they're not really talking about work at all. They're kind of joking about what they're going to do that night. And as they're driving down the road, and again, it's heavily forested, they look off to the right and there is some lights in the forest. They would say in interviews that they all noticed it, but it did not stand out as anything particularly bad. It just could be anything. They weren't thinking about it. But as they were driving down this road and this light, I guess got brighter, or maybe they couldn't help but notice it. They all started commenting on this light and they're looking at it. And somebody suggested that, it's probably just the moon, it's a full moon, But then one of the guys on the other side of the truck happened to look out his side, away from where that light was, and he goes, "No, the moon's over here. It's on this side of the road." So okay, it's not the moon. And then someone suggested, maybe it's a forest fire. Maybe we should go check it out. That could be a forest fire. But then Mike Rogers, the driver, the crew boss, was like, "No, there'd be smoke. There's no smoke or anything." And Travis, who he's the guy that's jumping out of cars to go chase down bears, and he's like a total kind of adrenaline junkie type. He's like, hey, let's just drive over there and see what it is. I don't know, could be anything. Let's go check it out. The guys in the truck were a little on edge about it, but ultimately said, what's the harm? We'll drive over. We know there's a road that brings us over to that section of the forest. We'll get a look at whatever this is, and then we'll leave. So they drive down this other little access road and they come to a clearing where these lights were, and they are astounded at what they see. They were all polygraphed separately about what they saw when they reached this clearing. Each of them described the same thing with slightly different details because it's from their own perspective, and the polygraph tests all showed that they were telling the truth. They saw this disc-shaped craft with what looked like panels of lights on the underside, hovering in a clearing maybe 50 or 100 feet off the ground, not spinning or anything, just floating in midair as if it was suspended. And the men, in their interviews later on TV shows and books, they would say what struck them was not just the fact that there's this craft here aft, but how bizarre it was to see this thing defying gravity. It's not moving, but it's hovering over the air and it's right in front of us. And one of the men even commented at length because he was actually. He would build houses and he was a handy guy, and he started talking about the structural framework of this craft. He could see that there was really impressive engineering on the underside of this craft. It was just a beautiful, beautiful machine. And they're looking at it, and Travis is so excited when they get to this clearing. He doesn't even know what he's looking at, but much like the bear where he jumps out and chases the bear, as soon as they were almost at a stop in this clearing, right next to the ship, he's jumping out of the car. Nobody else is, just Travis. And he starts walking just a little ways away from the car towards this craft. The craft doesn't move. The craft is maybe, from where they parked, maybe 50 or 100 feet away from them, and then 50 or 100 feet in the air, and the crew doesn't say anything. They're just dumbfounded by what they're looking at. Travis is also dumbfounded, but he's walking towards the ship, and he would say in an interview that he was frightened, but he was mostly curious. He knew he was looking at something that no one knew what it was, some sort of craft. They didn't know what it was, but it was fascinating to him. And he kept walking closer and closer and closer to it. And as the crew kind of came out of their initial shock of seeing this unidentified flying object in the sky, they start yelling for Travis to come back. They had this bad sense that something was going to happen, and they thought, you shouldn't go near it. Like, come back. Not to mention it's hovering in the air. What if it falls and it lands on you? Like, hey Travis, come back over here. And then it was like once one person started yelling for Travis to come back, they all did. And so, Travis remembered hearing them screaming for him to come back to the car, but he's not really paying any attention. He's still walking. And finally he stops. He's just looking at it. And Travis would say he was just struck at just the beauty of the underside of this craft, with all these different panels of lights built into it. It was this incredible piece of machinery. And he's looking at it, and then all of a sudden, it starts spinning just a little bit. It starts emitting this noise that all of them reported hearing, this loud mechanical sound. And now the yells from the crew are getting louder and louder. And Travis would say that he knew he needed to turn around and go back, but he just wanted to look for a few more seconds. And he was about to turn and go back to the truck when all of a sudden, a beam of light comes out and strikes Travis like a lightning strike. And all of the crew saw this happen. He gets blown 20 feet away. Like he gets lifted off the ground and thrown 20 feet. And they watched it happen. And again, in all of their polygraph tests, they all said the same thing. Oh, passed. He was hit by a ray of light from this UFO, knocked him 20 feet back. Mike Rogers, in a panic along with everybody else in the crew, they just decide to leave. And they're convincing themselves as Mike is driving away like a maniac, leaving Travis behind. They're convincing themselves that he's dead already. We just watched him get shot by something. We don't know what that is. And they're freaked out. They don't even know what they saw. They're crying, they're hysterical. These are grown men just absolutely terrified. And they're driving a little ways until finally, Mike just hits the brakes and he stops. And Mike is like, we have to go back for him. He was like, if you guys want to stay here and wait for me, that's fine. But this truck is going back to get Travis. And so, the idea of waiting out in the open after seeing what they just saw was even worse than going back. They wanted to stay together. So, a little bit begrudgingly, although they knew they needed to, they all got back in the truck, turned around, and started driving back up to the UFO site. As they make it back up, they notice that there's no lights up there. You know, the craft is gone and there's no Travis. And they get out, and now Mike is uncontrollably crying cause he feels like they just abandoned him. And where did he go? Everybody else is in shock. They can't believe it. They start screaming for Travis. They're running around the woods yelling for Travis, looking for signs of Travis. They really don't know what happened, but they know Travis is not here. And after a little bit of time of looking, they're like, we have to tell the police. And they knew that it was going to be bad for them when they told police the story is, a UFO came on, zapped Travis, and now he's gone. That doesn't really sit well with police, but they knew because they wanted to find Travis and they were very concerned about their friend. They knew they had to tell police. Mike and a few of the other crew were just unable to even think. They were crying, they were upset. And so finally they get to a payphone. This is the first payphone they saw, cause this is 1975, and Ken Peterson, who was this very kind of simple, matter-of-fact guy, recently married, just very simple guy, very level-headed guy. He decides to call the police cause he's the only one who is, I guess, composed enough to do it. And so he calls the sheriff's department and he says, "You gotta come out here. We can't find our friend Travis Walton. We'll have to describe it to you when you get here, because trying to do it over the phone is not gonna do it justice. But he's gone and we don't know where he went." So shortly thereafter, Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and Ken Copland, their partners, they show up at this rest stop where this payphone was. And they get to the scene, they see Ken Peterson who made the call to them, and they're like, "All right, tell us what's going on." The crew has now gotten out of the truck. They look distraught for sure. And Ken begins to try to describe what happened, but he hasn't said UFO. He hasn't said aliens. He's just said, we were up at the logging site. We had a contract up there. And then, it's hard to describe. And Mike Rogers jumps in. He's like, "We saw a UFO and a ray of light hit Travis and then he disappeared." And the sheriffs are looking at them like, "Really?" And so they stop them and we're like, "All right, I need to search your truck to make sure you guys aren't under the influence of something." And they're like, "We haven't done anything. We haven't. We've been working all day." They search the truck. Nothing. They check each of them to see if they're sober and their field tests show they were all sober. And the Sheriff Gillespie, who is the overall in charge sheriff, even though he was a total skeptic and so was Sheriff Copeland as well, he would say about that first engagement with the 6 crew members that they were obviously shaken up by something. Something had happened, they don't know what it was, but they were shaken up. And what Sheriff Gillespie believed was that they were creating a hoax to cover up a real crime. He believed that they had harmed Travis Walton and they were using a UFO to cover it up. But he also was thinking to himself like, this is a bad hoax. It's not very well planned. They don't really have their stories really lined up particularly well. They're not doing a good job explaining it. The only thing they're doing well is acting scared. A couple hours later, the sun's starting to come up cause it was super late when all this happened. And Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copeland have organized this huge search effort up in the forest where Travis had gone missing. And the crew members, they're all there as well. A bunch of volunteers showed up and they are scouring the area. I mean, they got dogs out, they got these huge teams looking everywhere and they can't come up with anything. I mean, they're looking everywhere. There's no sign. There's nothing. There's nothing from Travis. And so, while this is all going on, Sheriff Copeland and Sheriff Gillespie have started coming over to Mike Rogers and the rest of the crew and being like, "Hey, if you just tell us where Travis Walton's body is, we'll go easy on you guys. We know you did it." And they can feel that the pressure is really mounting. That they don't find Travis, even though they didn't do anything according to their story, they're gonna face serious repercussions. Because that's the way the world works. You don't get to say aliens did this and not have any blame placed on you, because there's no proof. They just have their own eyewitness testimony, that's it. And so, the crew has started to become very worried about what's going to happen. They're worried about Travis, of course, but they're starting to see that, they're going to be prosecuted for this unless they find Travis. And so they're all very stressed out. And they noticed during the search, this first day of searching, that these 3 guys wearing red jackets had these tools that were scanning the ground, almost like a metal detector. And Mike Rogers, he was hoping that during this investigation that they would have people come out that were like paranormal investigators. I guess maybe he was naive to think that the police would actually do that, but he thought, given the fact that we've all said this is a UFO that zapped Travis, who then disappeared, that they would have at least one person representing the kind of paranormal side of the investigation coming out. And so he sees these guys in red with their special tools that seem like a metal detector, and his gut says they're paranormal investigators. And so Mike goes over to them, and he's like, "Hey, what are these tools you guys are doing? Like, what is this?" And they look at him and they're like, "Oh, well, this tests for radiation. We're scanning for radiation in the area." And he asked them like, "Well, what group are you guys with? Are you with the sheriff's department?" And they just didn't really answer them. They said, "Oh, we're just checking for radiation in the area. That's just what we do." And Mike sees an opportunity because when that ship emitted that ray of light that ultimately blew Travis Walton 20 feet and then, evaporated him or something, they were within range of that big ball of lightning. And they were very much in the kind of cone where, had there been radiation coming off of that ship, he believed that perhaps they would have been hit with it. And so he asked the guys with the red jackets on in there, their little radiation tools to scan the crew's jackets and bodies to see if they were radioactive. And so the crew comes over and they scan them, there's nothing. There's no trace elements of radioactivity. They're like, "No, there's nothing." And then Mike realizes that from the time they called the sheriff, until this search, they had all the crew gone home and changed, then come out to do the search. And so he thought, well then, any of the radioactive materials would have been on our clothes, which aren't here. But we have our hard hats in the back of the truck that were out here the whole time. They were potentially exposed to whatever was out there from the ship. Can you test those? And so he brought over one of their helmets, and the guy in red scans his helmet and the ticker goes all the way over, fully radioactive. And the guy in red, looked up at that Mike and looked down at the helmet. He's scanning it and he's looking at him kind of trying to size him up. And then he turns and he kind of gestures at the other two in red and tells them to stop doing what they're doing. And they come over and they're scanning the helmets as well. And then without any indication of what the results were, what this meant, cause Mike is kind of waiting for them to tell them what's going to happen, the guys in red just turn around and say, "Okay." And they just start walking away. And Mike's like, "Well, wait. What does this mean?" And they don't turn around and they just walk away from the search site. And so the other crew are watching this happen too, and Mike and the crew are trying to get them to come back, but they're not turning around. They're just leaving, and then they're gone. And so Mike goes over to the sheriffs who they know. The sheriffs think they did something to Travis. These are not their friends. But they figured we need to ask them who those guys in red were. So they go over to Sheriff Gillespie and they're like, "Hey, who were those guys in red jackets with the radio? With the radiation detectors?" And Sheriff was like, "Who? John himself. There's no one here looking for radiation. Everyone here is here cause I ordered them to be here. Who are they? Where are they?" And he's like, "Well, they just walked over there. They went around the corner there." And Sheriff was like, "Well, I didn't order them there." And it would turn out that they couldn't locate these three people. No one knew who they were. Mike went around and asked anybody who seemed like an authority figure if they knew who these people were. They asked people if they had interacted with them, and no one knew. So after the search, that goes on for a couple of days, turns up nothing, there's no sign of Travis. The town of Snowflake, Arizona, really turned on the 6 crew members. Everybody believed that they had done something to Travis. That this UFO thing was a hoax and that they harmed Travis. And they were using this as a cover-up. And the sheriff department, they really perpetuated that. They were pretty open about, this is not a UFO situation. This is not an alien abduction. This is a missing person case. And frankly, we believe the UFO thing is a hoax. National and international media had picked this story up, and it became this massively viral story all over the world. And news media outlets are converging on Snowflake, Arizona, and they're inundating the sheriff's department with requests for more information about this alien abduction. And it's really frustrating the 2 sheriffs who are leading this investigation, Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copeland. And they were already skeptical and really upset about feeling like they were being taken advantage of by these crew members. This hoax, right? That's what they believed it was. And so Sheriff Gillespie and Copeland decided, you know what? We're gonna just cut through all the BS here, and we're gonna make these boys take a lie detector test. So they go out and get one of the country's best polygraph examiners to come in and administer a lie detector test on each of the 6 crew members. And so, one by one over the course of the day, each crew member was tested for 2 hours. Same questions, all centering on the criminal side, the kind of foul play angle for Travis Walton. They all go through it, and it turned out that 5 of the 6 had all shown that they were telling the truth. And the 6th person, it was just inconclusive. It didn't mean that he was lying. It just meant that the test wasn't done very well. And this polygraph examiner had anywhere from a 92 to 98% accuracy rate. He was one of the best in the country. And he even would say, like, it would be so difficult to fake that. To have 5 people, let's say this is all a big hoax and they harmed Travis Walton. It would be almost impossible to have 5 people be able to pass my examination and have nobody slip up. They were telling the truth. And so the examiner tells the sheriff, and the sheriff is, Sheriff Gillespie is dumbfounded, cause he believed that they were gonna find out they were all lying and that this could just be a pure criminal investigation. And it would be investigation. Let's go find Travis Walton's body. But now the examiner's saying they're telling the truth. And so Detective Gillespie and his partner are like, now what do? We do. And then, 5 days after Travis's disappearance, Travis shows back up. During numerous interviews, Travis would say that he remembers waking up on a road and he didn't recognize where he was. But it was nighttime, it was raining, and he sensed a very bright light above him. And so, as he's laying, he kind of turns his head to look up into the sky and he sees what looks like the underside of that ship, cause he remembered how struck he was by the beauty of the kind of engineering underneath that disc UFO they saw in the forest. It looked the same. His vision was not great, but he's looking up and he's pretty confident that's what he's looking at. And then it flies into the sky and it's gone. And he's left in total darkness on a road in some place he doesn't know. And he remembers standing up and feeling very weak and depleted and dehydrated. And he just knew that he had to get to civilization. He had to just go in a direction and find someone who could help him. Because he was so weak and he would die out there if he didn't find someone who could help. And so he musters the strength to stand up, and he starts kind of staggering down the road. And eventually, through just adrenaline, he just starts running. And luckily, he sees up ahead there is a rest stop. And at rest stops, there's payphones. And he makes his way down and he goes to the payphone, and he has change in his pockets still. He puts it in the payphone and he ends up calling his brother. And his brother he can't believe he's talking to Travis, because Travis is probably supposed to be dead at this point. He didn't believe it was Travis, but Travis just said to him over and over again, "It's me. He brought me back." And he tells him where he is, because now he recognizes that this rest stop is actually in Snowflake, Arizona. When his brother picks him up, Travis would say that he believed that this was just minutes after, the initial abduction. He didn't even know he had been abducted. This is like he's coming to and he's like, "Man, what happened?" Like, I was just over at that clearing where I saw this ship, and now I'm over here. Like, what am I doing here? And so Travis's brother is looking at him like, "Where have you been? We've been so worried about you for the past several days." And Travis, who was kind of almost catatonic, he's in shock, he doesn't know what's going on. He looks at his brother and he's like, "What do you mean, days?" And his brother's like, "You've been missing for 5 days. And so Travis would say that when he heard this news, this revelation that he had been missing for 5 days, it absolutely put him into shock. He was in a light catatonic state where he couldn't make sense of it. And so he just sat there quietly. And his brother's like looking at him, not really sure what to even ask. He asked a couple times, "What happened?" And Travis just didn't answer cause he didn't know, he didn't know. He couldn't. He couldn't explain it. And so Travis's brother decides, instead of just immediately calling the police, I want to bring you to a hospital because clearly that needs to happen. And frankly, with the media circus, as soon as they find out you're back, it's just going to be mayhem. And I want to make sure you're taken care of first. So he drives to Phoenix, Arizona, and he brings him to a hospital. And he asked the doctors to be discreet. He has a doctor do an examination. The doctor knew who Travis Walton was cause he'd been following the news. And he's doing an examination of Travis and he was malnourished and he was tired and looked very sick. But there was no physical wounds with the exception of he had one puncture site in his arm, in the crook of his arm. Travis was not a drug user, so it wasn't like that was, a mark from using drugs. It was a puncture site, and they assumed someone had recently put a needle in his arm. And also the doctor drug tested him and tested his blood, and there was no drugs in his system. It wasn't like he'd been using any sort of substance, so he kind of had a clear bill of health, minus the injection site and looking pretty ragged. And so after the examination, Travis's brother brings Travis back to his home in Phoenix, Arizona. As soon as they get back, his home phone is getting constant phone calls. It had made its way to the sheriff's department back in Snowflake, Arizona, and they are nonstop calling Travis's brother like, hey, we hear he's back. We have to talk to him. We have to talk to him. Sheriff Gillespie, he drives all the way to Phoenix. He goes in and he sits down to talk to Travis. And Sheriff Gillespie would say that Travis looked like he was in shock. He looked like he had been through something traumatic. It did not seem like he was acting. And he starts asking Travis what happened. And Travis, he does mention the UFO. Hey, he mentioned seeing this thing in a clearing. He gets struck by some light. He doesn't know what it was. And then, he's on the road 5 days later and he can't really make sense of what happened. He just didn't really know what happened over the 5 days. And finally, Sheriff Gillespie just kind of doesn't really give up. He's like, well, we have no way to arrest him. We have no proof of anything. And so we decided we're going to be in touch. And he drives back. And then media starts showing up. Huge news trucks start showing up outside. Everybody found out because this was a huge story where he was, and everybody wanted answers. Finally, the National Enquirer, they reached out and they said, hey, if you give us an exclusive story, if Travis speaks to us about what happened to him, we will get you out of here. We'll bring you to a private location. And we'll even pay to have Travis undergo a whole other battery of tests that are not typically done to see if they could figure out what had happened to see him. And so they agreed to go with the National Enquirer. So by the time he's actually sitting there, looking at the National Enquirer, he's had a little bit of time to maybe let his memory kind of kick back in about what had happened. And he's having these flashes of memory of what happened over those 5 days. Cause initially all he could remember was seeing the craft and then being on the road 5 days later. And so when he's sitting down with the National Enquirer people, he begins to recall what actually happened over those 5 days. And so, this is what he said happened. He said that he remembers getting out of the truck and walking up to this craft, and he remembers his crew members yelling at him to come back. He knew they were yelling at him to come back. He just wanted to look at the craft a little bit longer. And then, right as he was about to turn around and head back, the craft started moving. This loud, kind of mechanical, eerie sound is being made. And before he had a chance to run back, he gets hit with this lightning bolt of some kind. Then he remembers being in the presence of some doctors. He saw white lab coats, masks, and facial coverings. And he's kind of out of consciousness. And he's, this orange light around him. But he definitely sees what looks like medical professionals. And he's thinking to himself, whatever happened with that ship, it must have hurt me, and my crew must have scooped me up and brought me to the hospital. And so, in his kind of an undoubted state, he's aware that he's around medical professionals. At least what he believes are medical professionals. And at some point, his vision clears. It goes from foggy and he's in undoubt to being pretty much lucid. And he looks down at his chest and there's a rectangular box sitting on his chest that he didn't recognize. It didn't really look like modern medical equipment. It just looked like this, almost like a rock sitting on his chest. And he looks at that, and then he looks up at one of the people who's wearing a mask, who's working on him, one of the medical professionals. And this person is working on this box. And then the person looks at Travis Walton, and then leans in to look even closer at Travis Walton. And Travis is horrified. It was this grayish, thin, narrow-headed figure that was very short, maybe like 4 feet high, who was looking in at him. And its eyes were like slits, and it's looking at Travis. And Travis, who's unbelievably scared at this point, pushes everything off of him and drips out all the cords that are attached to him. Kind of topples off of this table that he was on, and he realizes he's in a fairly small room. And there's 3 of these humanoid creatures in the room with him. And he picks up the biggest instrument he can see next to the table that he was just laying on. He didn't know what it was, and he starts kind of wildly waving it at them and screaming to leave him alone. Like, get away from me. And he's trying to make sense of what he's looking at, and the 3 figures in lab coats start walking closer and closer to him. And they're just kind of looking up at him, trying to study him a little bit. They get all the way up to him and he's waving, and he's almost about to hit one of them, when they just kind of abruptly turn around and leave the room, leaving him alone in this kind of examination room. And as soon as they leave, he watches them go down the little, outside the door, down the little hallway, and they turn left. And so he's practically paralyzed with fear, but he knows if he can't get out of this room, he's done for. And so finally, he kind of gets himself together, and he walks past the examination table. He goes down the hallway outside of the door, and instead of going left where they went, he kind of sneaks off to the right and starts walking. And he comes to another room, and it's a room that has a single chair in it. It's this tiny little room with a chair, and the chair is turned away from him. He begins to peer around the chair, and he sees that no one is sitting there. So he goes in front of the chair and he's like touching the wall, looking for a doer, knob, or any sort of mechanism that can get him out of this room. And he said, like the room, it was like this perfectly flat. But everything was flat and smooth. There was no door handles. He couldn't find a way out. And he ultimately sees on the chair that it looks like there's some buttons on the chair itself. And he pushes all these buttons on the chair and nothing happens. And then in the doorway where he came in, suddenly a man appears in the doorway who's wearing what looks like a spacesuit, like an astronaut suit. And Travis is so immediately relieved, even though the weirdness of him being in an astronaut suit is pretty high, but he's like, it's a human. And he doesn't know what to think about the fact that he's now excited to see a human, right? Like, it's terrifying that you were just around these non-humans, but he's like in panic mode now. He sees another human being and he runs over to him and he says, please, you gotta help me. I don't know where I am. You know, where are we? What is this? What's going on? And he notices that the eyes of this person inside of a spacesuit, it's a man who at least looks like a man, but his eyes are distant. He's not making eye contact with Travis. It's like he's in a trance. And he said his eyes just seemed off. Like they weren't focused on him. It would be like if you're talking to someone, but they were like permanently looking away from you. There was just something off about him. And he never spoke. And so he's trying to ask this guy like, are we? And the guy takes him by the arm and he just starts leading him back into the hall where he came from. And continued down the hall, not back towards the room where he was originally, but down the hall in the other direction. And they get to another door and he opens it up, and Travis the whole time is like pleading with this guy to help him. And he thinks that this guy is helping him. He thinks that this is his savior. And he feels relieved that a human being, albeit a strange human being, is helping him. And eventually, he stops asking him any questions, cause the guy in the spacesuit's just not reacting to him. They open the door and they go down into this huge hangar where there's all these spacecraft that look just like the one that he saw in the clearing that Travis saw in the clearing. And they start walking down between all these spacecraft that are just hovering, much like they were hovering in the forest, seemingly able to justify gravity. And the whole time, this guy in the spacesuit's saying nothing, and Travis is like, "What is this? What are these crafts? Is this military?" Saying nothing. They walk to the far side of the hangar and they open up another door, and they go into another bright white room. And there's 3 more human-like people with the strange thing going on, in spacesuits that are standing there next to another medical table. And they're looking not at Travis, but their bodies are aimed in the direction of the door they came in through. Travis goes in, he sees these 3 and he thinks, "These people are here to save me." Like again, I feel relieved to see humans, albeit strange humans, but nonetheless humans. And the guy who had brought him in there continues to lead him over to the 3 other people, and they pick him up and they put him on the table. He starts kind of resisting cause he doesn't know what they're doing. They're not speaking. He's like, "What are you doing?" And they force him onto this table, and he's feeling pretty weak at this point. Then they take a gas mask and they put it over his face, and then he blacks out. And his next memory after that is when he woke up on the road and had the light above him that flew away, and he had to run down to the payphone to call his brother. Travis did not immediately go and speak to the crew members that were there that night. It took quite a bit of time. He was talking to press. He was, doing interviews. The police wanted to talk to him. There's a lot going on. But he eventually got together with the other 6 crew members, and they all met up at Mike Rogers, the crew boss's, houses. And they just said, "You gotta tell us what happened." And so he sits down and he tells the story. All of them believed him. They didn't want to believe him, but they believed him because they saw the first half of the story. They saw it for themselves. And once he was done telling it, they didn't really have that many questions. They just felt bad. They felt like if they had just stayed their end and taken Travis, he wouldn't have been taken. But they didn't know that. And so all of them would leave Mike's house that day, and they would all go their separate ways. They did not stay in touch. They went their separate ways. It was like this hugely traumatic event that even to this day, 40 years later, when they talk about it, they're often brought to tears. Ken Peterson. His interviews are particularly striking because when he talks about it, he's an older man now, and he says, to this day, "I'm scared to look out my window because I'm afraid I'm gonna see a spaceship." And he starts crying when he talks about it. I mean, this had a profound impact on these 7 men, and some of them didn't do so well. This whole story, it ruined their credibility. Even though this is, the most believable alien abduction story, the truth is most people think it's a hoax. One of them, like his own family, basically disowned him cause they felt so embarrassed about this whole story. They don't believe him. So if this was a hoax, to what end? What did they get out of it? Nothing. It damaged their lives. Following this case over the span of 40 years, there would be 16 lie detector tests taken, 5 by Travis Walton and 11 by the remaining crew, and they would all pass. The one member of that initial polygraph set when 5 had passed and 1 was inconclusive, he was retested, the same exact test, and he did pass. It's just one of those things where we're left with this incredible story where modern technology says they're telling the truth, but we can't fit the truth into what we think of as normal life. And so we've just decided that there's going to be a group of people that believe and there's going to be a group of people that don't, and you're left to pick which side you're on. So I'd love to hear what side you use it on. Was this a hoax? Was this an abduction? Or was this something else? Let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll do my best to get back in touch with you. And if you haven't already, please gently extrapolate the like button and then also subscribe to my channel, turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my 3-2 for weekly uploads every week. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok where my handle is MrBallen. That's gonna do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Talk soon. It's often said that truth is stranger than fiction, and in today's story, that's definitely the case. If this were a work of fiction, I think that readers or viewers wouldn't really engage with it. It would seem like the author was trying hard to make it scary and bizarre. They would just feel like, yeah, too much, This is not relatable. This is not relatable. But it's true. And if you were to look it up online, this story, you'd get dozens of resources confirming it's true. All the legitimate media outlets and blogs and police reports, it would all show you that this really did happen. But because it's so well documented, because it's so true, the way it's presented if you look it up is, here's what happened. Here's the answer to the mystery. Because it was a mystery, but it was solved. They start with the solution, and then they tell you what lead up to it. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tell this like a mystery. I'm gonna tell you the strangeness first before I reveal what ultimately happened. Because there is a solution, and it's crazy and tragic. Because this story I'm gonna share with you today is actually the prequel to a whole host of horrible things that happened to a town. Before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format like I'm promising to do today, then you've come to the right channel because that's all I do. And I upload 3 to 4 times a week. And so, if that's your deal, I would ask you to gently pulverize the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those 3-2 for weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. In 1996, Annie and Jessica Andrews, who were teenage sisters, unfortunately lose their mother to cancer. It was a relatively abrupt death, caught the family by surprise. And so, following her death, Annie and Jessica lived full-time with their father, Brian Andrews. Now, Brian worked a lot, but with the death of his wife, he had to work even more to make sure he was bringing home enough of an income to provide for his 2 daughters. Annie and Jessica were hit very hard by the loss of their mother. They were very close with her and, with their father being gone so much, those 2 were left alone a lot at the house and left alone with their thoughts. And they missed their mom. And so one night when Brian was out at work, the girls decided to use a YU boarding to try to contact their mother. And they would even admit that they didn't really expect anything to happen. They just wanted some sort of connection to their mother who they missed terribly. So they went down in the basement, they got out the YU board, and they have like a seance. They didn't really do much research into how to do it or what to do it. They basically just started, kind of asking if their mother was here, could she give them some sign? And so they had this kind of YU board seance, and, nothing comes of it. Brian is not home for this, their father is not home, and it's just those 2. And after, a couple of hours of doing this seance, they ultimately put it away. And in a way, it was kind of a cathartic experience that they got to, think about their mom really intently and kind of think maybe she could be with them right then. And in many ways, the seance was a success because it made them feel closer to their mom, even if it was just for a moment and if it was artificial. So they put the YU board away and the girls go upstairs and they're kind of having a low-key night and ultimately decide to go to bed. Now, their father has not come home yet, so just the girls, they're used to this. This is how a lot of nights went, and as they're laying in bed, they both start hearing tapping sounds. Now, they're in separate rooms, and they heard the same tapping sounds. And in fact, Jessica would get up and come into Annie's room and say, "Hey, do you hear the tapping sound on the walls?" And Annie's like, "Yeah, I hear it too." And they're listening, and there's silence. And they hear this kind of like tapping sound in the walls. They didn't know what it was. They'd never heard it before. And the girls again, they missed their mother so terribly, and they were basically hoping that it was their mom. They knew it couldn't be, but they were hoping it was off. And so they're like, it's mom? Mom's trying to get in touch with us. She's making sounds to get in touch with us. It's from a seance. It must have worked. And they start asking their mother questions like, are you here with us right now? And can you show yourself to us? And are you looking after us? Just like questions that you would imagine people might ask if they thought, the ghost of a loved one was in the room with them. And so it was also kind of reassuring that you have, what they believed to be the spirit of their mother looking out for them. And when their father finally came home that night, the tapping at this point had stopped, and they rushed to tell their father about the tapping they heard, and they were happy about it. They weren't scared about it. They were happy about it. And Brian, he's worked all day and he's grieving the loss of his wife, and he thinks that his daughters are making it up, especially cause they told him about the why you bored. And he's just thinking to himself, they're grieving, they're struggling with the loss of their mother. They're grieving. And he felt really bad for them. And he even considered that first night putting them into therapy, not because he was upset with them or anything, but because he's like, this is a manifestation of grief. But he ultimately said, look guys, just go back to bed. I'm sure she's looking out for us. Go to bed. Let's. We'll talk about this tomorrow. So the girls went back to their rooms. Brian didn't think much of it. He was just thinking, should I bring the girls to grief counseling? Something like that. And everybody goes to bed. Now, this tapping would persist for several days. The tapping got so frequent that it actually started disturbing the girls' sleep. And every time they would yell to their father to come in and check, the tapping would stop. And so it was like kind of driving them crazy. And then when they would all leave the house during the day and the evening, whatever, anytime the house was empty, and so they would come back to the house and, things would be moved. Furniture would be moved slightly out of position. Some of the silverware had been moved around. Just little things all over the house. And Annie and Jessica's father is quick to say, guys, I know this is I know you miss your mom, and you want this to be real, that you want your mom to be here with us right now. But she's not. And you gotta stop this whole ghost thing. You gotta stop moving the furniture around. This is not healthy, If this continues, I'm gonna ask that you guys start seeing a grief counselor. And the girls were insistent that it was not them. And the fact that their father didn't believe them, and they knew it wasn't them, it put them in a really bad spot because they felt totally alone. Scared to be in their house because now it didn't really feel like their mother. It felt like something screwing with them. And that's not something their mother would do. And so they're thinking that this is like an evil ghost that they've unlocked through that why you bored seance, and it's now terrorizing them. And there's nothing they can do cause their father doesn't believe them, and it's just consistently happening. They don't know what to do. One evening, in January of 1987, the girls were together in the front room of their house and they started hearing tapping sounds again. And so, they hear this tapping sound not coming from the walls, but coming from the basement. And suddenly they feel, some confidence, like they're gonna go down and confront this thing. Because their father doesn't believe them, they don't know what to do, so they're just gonna go face this thing head on. So they head right downstairs into the basement, and there's nothing. The tapping stops as soon as they're down there, and they can't find anything. As they turn to go back upstairs, feeling a little bit silly that they're gonna go fight this ghost, they notice writing in reed that says, "Come find me, I'm in your closet." And they're horrified because now this is like confirmation that this thing is screwing with them. It's not their mother, and it's now interacted outside of just tapping. It's actually writing on the walls. And so the girls run out of the house because this feels like a threat. They felt threatened by everything that was happening before, but it was almost like the writing on the wall was a was a step over the line. This felt like a direct, intentional threat towards the girls, kind of DEF, absolutely taunting them, unscaring them. So they run out of the house. Their father was not there. He was working. And so the girls ran next door to their neighbors and said, can we stay with you for a minute? Something weird's happening in our house. They began to get into the weird writing on the walls, but didn't really go into too much detail. And the neighbor said, we're just gonna wait for your father to come home before we do anything. And so the girls stay with the neighbor. Brian comes home. As soon as they see Brian pulling in the driveway, they flag him down. He comes over to the neighbors. Neighbor pulls Brian aside and says, here's what happened. They came over here. The girls are hysterical, and they tell their dad that there's writing inside the house. And so Brian, his first reaction is, this is out of control now, guys. This is too much. He goes over, though, with them to the house, and he goes into the basement. He sees the writing on the wall, and his thought is like, now you guys are, defacing our property too, to live out this kind of fantasy. And so this, for him, was the line in the sand that they've now crossed. It's now getting totally unhealthy, and he ordered them to go see grief counseling. So that actually began at this point. Several weeks would go by with no tapping, no anything, just silence in the house. It was almost like whatever this was had stopped. Then one night when Brian is working late into the night once again and the girls are alone, they're in the front room together and they're just sitting there. It's been nice having a couple weeks without any strangeness in the house. And they start hearing tapping from somewhere else in the house. Then they get up. They kind of creep their way over to where they think they're hearing it. And it's coming from Annie's bedroom. When they go into Annie's bedroom, written on the walls is, I'm back. Find me if you can. Just like the last time they saw writing on the wall, they run out of the house. They flee the house. They go to the same neighbor's house and they say, it happened again. You gotta believe me, it happened again. The neighbor says, stay with me. We'll wait for your father again. Father comes home. Same situation plays out. He gets flagged over to the neighbor's house. The neighbor says, hey, they're back again with the writing on the wall. And Brian's mad. And he says to the girls, like, I put you in counseling. I'm telling you to stop doing this. Like, this isn't okay, it's not healthy. And he tells the girls and the neighbor to stay here all. I'm gonna go in that house, and I'm gonna search the house top to bottom to show you that there's nothing to be afraid of in that house. And so, he goes back to his own house, and when he opens the door, the house is in total disarray. It's like someone had ransacked the house, and he's thinking to himself, the girls didn't do this. Someone else did this. And so now he's on edge and he walks through the house. He's not hearing anything. And he goes up to Annie's bedroom and he sees the writing on the wall. And then he looks. He sees a man standing in the closet wearing women's clothes, which would turn out to be his dead wife's clothes, wearing a wig, carrying a hatchet. And this man in the dress is staring at Brian. And Brian's startled. The guy starts running out. Brian tries to grapple and fight with him, but the man in the dress manages to run past Brian out into the rest of the house. Brian is so caught off guard because this guy's got a hatchet. He doesn't know what he's gonna do. He starts chasing after him, but the guy's gone. Brian's looking in his house, but finally Brian just leaves the house cause this guy's got a hatchet. He runs outside, he runs over to his neighbor's house and he's like, call 911. There's somebody in the house. He makes sure his girls are okay. He stays with his neighbor, calls the police. The police go in and they look everywhere and they can't find anything. And they say to Brian I'm sure someone was here. It's a very convincing story you've just told, but they're not here now. And unfortunately, all we can do is tell you, you probably should not be here right now until whoever this was is caught. And you should stay with some relatives. We'll watch the house, We'll see if anybody else comes back. But there's not much we can do. And so, unfortunately, the girls and the father are are left with no answer to what was going on or who this person was. And Brian's thinking to himself, like, how did he get away? How did this guy in the dress get away? Like, how did that happen? I mean, they're searching the neighborhood. He's wearing a pretty distinctive outfit. How did he get away? And so for 2 weeks, Brian and his daughters stayed with some family. But in those 2 weeks, no one found out who this guy in the dress was. I mean, Brian and the girls are traumatized. Brian feels like this horrible father that... But I've left my girls alone in the house over and over and over again with some crazy person with an axe in my house. I never believed them. What could have happened to them? It would have been my fault. And so, it's a horrible time period. The girls are traumatized cause now they realize they've been interacting with some crazy person in a dress with an axe in their walls. And it's just this horrible situation. But after 2 weeks, it's tough living with another family member. It's a tight place they're staying. Then they decide, you know what? At this point, whoever that guy was, he must have ran away. We got police watching the house. Let's just go home. We'll lock everything up. We'll get a security system. There's police watching the house. Let's just go home. And so they decide, okay, let's pack up and head home. And so, as Brian is driving up his street, he looks at his house and he can see that there's a light on in the second floor. And he's thinking to himself like, I thought the police were just watching it from the outside and just kind of patrolling the neighborhood. I didn't know there'd be police inside my house. And as he's looking up at the window, about to pull into his driveway, he sees the guy in the dress suddenly walk across the window. He sees him clear as day. So he stops what he's doing and he calls the police. Police are there in a second. The house is surrounded. So, with the house surrounded, police finally go inside. Now, no one's been inside the house since Brian and the girls left. They locked it up and they were monitoring it. There was no police inside the house. There's nobody inside the house. Supposedly. The police, when they open up the door and go inside, the first thing they notice is not only is all the furniture flipped upside down and moved all over the place, but there are pennies glued to the ceiling. All these pennies glued to the ceiling, and there's red writing all over the house, on all the walls, in weird places. Just writing, strange, cryptic writing. But they search the house and they don't find anything. But one of the officers who was down in the basement at one point noticed that there was a little piece of wood covering up what looked like a crawl space behind the washer and dryer. And he found that he could very easily move aside the washer and the dryer, and there was this board that when he pulled it aside, it was the entrance to a crawl space. In the crawl space, they find that someone had kind of burrowed between all of the insulation all around the house into all the walls. And there are these little peepholes in all the different rooms that whoever was in the crawl space could look into any room at any given time. And as they're searching this intricate crawl space that spanned the whole house, they find Danny LaPlante, who was this totally deranged teenager who had briefly dated Annie. Annie had broken it off with him, and so he had snuck into their house and had been living in their walls, listening to their conversations. Had heard about Annie's mother passing away and had kind of adopted this "I'm gonna pretend to be your dead mother" routine, and had been writing in ketchup on the walls and tapping. He had watched them do the seance, and so he had all this stuff to work with to really spook them, and had been sneaking out and moving furniture around and sneaking back into the walls for months. And that's not even the worst of it. Danny LaPlante, after he was brought out of the crawl space, was arrested and put into a juvenile detention center. And then when he got out of the detention center later in 1987, for reasons that no one understands, I don't even think Danny understands, he broke into someone's house and murdered almost an entire family in cold blood. I don't know about you guys, but the idea of somebody living in my walls for 2 months doing anything is horrifying, let alone being Danny LaPlante, the psychopath that he was very vocal about it. But what really trips me out is when the police went in that second turn when they had the house surrounded, and they find pennies glued to the ceiling and writing on the wall, and then they find him in this intricate crawl space. Like, that's straight out of a horror movie. That wouldn't be scary cause it's just too many weird elements. But it happened. And I just think about the trauma that the Andrews family undoubtedly has suffered. Not only the loss of their wife, their mother, but imagining what could have happened to them. Because Daddy would go on to murder almost an entire family. Just as easily could have been them. And so I would imagine I'd be shocked if they ever got over it. That's a deep-seated trauma that, I can only hope that they were able to recover from. If you enjoyed this story and you want more content like this, if you would please gently pulverize the like button and then also subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my weekly 2 for video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen for 160. I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen, same as my YouTube channel. And I go live 3 times a week on TikTok as well, So, I hope to read your comments and see you on other platforms. And until next time, that's gonna do it. Thank you guys so much. Take care.